The first two Hellboy films were written and directed by Guillermo del Toro and felt very much like Men in Black but with demons. While generally well received, they have a completely different tone than the comics. For example, Hollywood just loves to create romantic relationships out of thin air. The new Hellboy appears to be following the original comics more closely, which I know fans will respect. Del Toro already had a reputation for using a neat blend of practical effects and CGI to make some really great monsters in a unique fantasy setting, which he brought to Hellboy and which I really loved. Hellboy was originally played by Ron Perlman, with plans to make a trilogy, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So now Hellboy is getting a reboot instead, which has the potential to be very disappointing for fans of the first two films.
What took you so long?
However, I didn't want to lose hope, as the new director, Neil Marshall, directed the horror film The Descent, as well as cult classic Dog Soldiers, and two popular Game of Thrones episodes, which both had large-scale battles. Given the freedom of an R rating, this hombre definitely added horror elements. The film starts off with a bird plucking out an eyeball, paired with an F-bomb. This version of Hellboy is much more gruesome and visually disturbing, and there are some interesting combat scenes. For example, there's a scene with Hellboy fighting giants that was edited to look like one long shot. Even though a few frames look kinda crappy, it was a fun idea and a fun scene. No disrespect to previous films, but I miss the old days before it seemed like every film's goal was to stay PG-13 for the sake of accessibility and profit. Now I see it as ballsy when a film goes R-rated, and I appreciate blood because in a real apocalypse, people are going to curse and lose limbs. I personally loved the gore in this film because it felt appropriate given the subject is demons from hell. That said, I know many don't like that, and there are at least a few scenes that I'm sure some will find to be over the top. If you have an iron stomach, there's a wonderfully disgusting scene where Hellboy meets the witch Baba Yaga that I'm sure you'll enjoy, as well as a scene with very cool looking demons terrorizing people. It helps that the new Hellboy visually looks great and is being played by David Harbour, who has already proven he's a great actor with experience playing a grumpy cynic. Harbour is easily the best part of every scene, and I believe him to be a worthy successor to Perlman. I also thought it was interesting how, unlike past films, he has a much more contentious relationship with his father, played by Ian McShane. Hellboy has new sidekicks. I wasn't sure about them at first, because I thought they were just okay, but they grew on me and I think they have potential. However, I'm certain many will be sad about Abraham Sapien's absence, regardless of how they feel about these characters. Besides Hellboy, I actually empathize with his pig rival the most. I know some people are not fans of the new standard Marvel has set for superhero movies, and there are signs of Marvel influence in this film, like the style of humor or the fact the music is more a nostalgic rock playlist rather than an orchestral score like the work Danny Elfman did for Hellboy 2. There's even a couple of post-credit scenes. I happen to like this approach, and I think it's being used because it's effective. Even the cheesy scenes felt like it was meant to be that way, as a sort of self-aware campiness. Here's the deal, I highly expect this film is going to receive a lot of undeserved hate. A part of me wants to be like, but I also think it's really f***ed up how the comic creator Mike Mignola did both Del Toro and Perlman dirty, the way he dumped them for this third film. I really do understand the fans' frustrations, and I feel that they should have finished the original trilogy before rebooting. Nobody would know the name Hellboy had it not been for their efforts. Obviously, it pissed off a lot of people, including Jeffrey Tambor. It obviously affected Perlman as well, and now we will probably never see the end of the original trilogy despite years of waiting.
So I felt like we had owed the fans closure, and I just couldn't. There were too many people who were moving in too many other directions that I just couldn't pull it off. So if you ask me about it, it's kind of still an open wound.
Yeah.
I'm sure Hollywood politics, as well as irate fans who feel like they were slapped in the face, will ensure this movie gets bombed harder than usual. However, if I'm being absolutely honest, and I rate this film as a standalone film while ignoring the previous films, I would say that it gets a lot of things right and was very enjoyable, especially if you go in knowing what to expect. It has some really interesting creatures and some nice little surprises because at its core it's a quick-moving, chaotic film, which some will hate and others will find to be a fun change of pace. I have to give this film 6 out of 10 dog humps to stay consistent with my own metric. However, I have to admit that I think I like this film much more than that due to personal preferences, and I would bump it up an extra point or two for myself, but just because I crave more R-rated action doesn't mean others will. Deep down, only you know whether or not the absence of Perlman and Del Toro will affect your viewing experience. It also depends on whether you're squeamish or love gore, and whether or not you're tired of comic book adaptations. If someone says the first two films were literally perfect, I think it's a sign of bias, because perfect is a very strong word, and using hyperbolic language and having a hardcore level of dedication to the originals will probably make it impossible to enjoy the reboot, so please don't murder me just because I had fun with this film. I'm putting my balls to the fire for the sake of honesty, so feel free to disagree and let me know how you feel. Will many prefer the first two films? Yeah, probably. Is the film complete garbage? No, I don't know about that. I hear there's no tacos in hell. I'll let you know when I get there.